Forgive me.
Yeah, they're all ready to go. Probably not. If that's, can you bring this to the side? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Backwards and forwards.
And you'll see a little.
Self-destruct button.
You'll see a little monitor there. That's right. And then
Yep, we are.
Can I ask you, excuse me, to take your seats for the afternoon session, please? Well, welcome back, everybody, and I'm delighted that after, I think, what was a very strong morning and a very good award ceremony, we've got what promises to be a very strong afternoon as well. It's a great pleasure to welcome Kevin Bakhurst of Ofcom as the first speaker. I shall leave the introduction in more detail of Kevin to Sarah Thane, who is chair of the session. Sarah herself has had a distinguished career as a regulator. I won't go into all the different manifestations, but she knows the industry inside out. And she also has the distinction, and we have the honour, that she's a patron of the VLV. So, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Colin. And good afternoon to everybody. That was really rather good fun, having the awards. So I hope we can keep the momentum going from that rather joyful interlude. I was struck this morning by the number of references to the gender pay gap. And then I looked at the agenda and I thought, well, this morning's chairs were 2 men. This afternoon's chairs are 2 women. But I think the VLV are never guilty of a pay gap because we all do it for nothing. So let's get that one on the record. I'm delighted to have been asked by Colin to chair this session. There's a sort of deliciousness about it for me. If you've read, one of the places I worked was in the build team for Ofcom and was advisor content and standards. So when Colin said, we'd like you to chair the session with Kevin Bakhurst, it felt like a nice synergy. Kevin, as you will know, has been at Ofcom for about 18 months now, but has a deep vein of public service broadcasting experience running through him in news, in many positions at the BBC, including deputy head of the BBC Newsroom and controller of the BBC News Channel. And then he had a period at RTE in Ireland where he was Deputy Director General and Managing Director of News and Current Affairs. So I imagine an awful lot of the discussion this morning about news and fake news and all the rest of it is, you know, meat and drink, both in your past and your present life. And we're very privileged to have you come and talk to us this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Kevin to speak. His title of his speak is After the Crown, Supporting the Crown Jewels of UK Broadcasting. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try a bit of a high wire trick later on, which is to show a few slides. So if it goes wrong, you've got to live with me, I'm afraid. First of all, I just want to say it's always a privilege. It's a bit of a pain to follow Jon Snow because he's very entertaining, but it's always a privilege to follow Jon because he is one of the great figures of UK broadcasting news, and he's admired from people around the UK newsrooms. The other thing I would just like to say is it struck me sitting through the awards ceremony that the range of nominees in particular, and the range of winners, but the range of nominees in particular, does show the incredible value and importance of the content of public service broadcasting in the UK. And my boss, Sharon White, gave a speech only a few weeks ago, which was to underline Ofcom's role in supporting public service broadcasting and playing our role in making sure, as best we can, that public service broadcasting continues to thrive in the UK media environment. I'm delighted to be here today. I was thinking when I was invited about the last time I attended a VLV conference, and it tested my memory, I have to say. It was probably back in around 2005 when I was still working for the BBC then, and I was editor of the 10 o'clock news. And I came along, I was a member of the audience. But I do remember coming along then that, and this was always a view within the BBC when I was there, that the support, the advice, and the work that is done by VLV was always truly appreciated by me then and also by my colleagues at the BBC. When I did that job at the BBC, I felt uniquely privileged every day to have a window on the world and a very singular set of responsibilities. I spent all day, every day, watching global and UK events unfold. I discussed the meaning of those events with BBC correspondents and producers, and then we decided how to try and tell those stories to millions of viewers in homes around the country, hopefully so they would find them interesting and informative. Since that time, as you've heard, I worked at the Irish national broadcaster RT for 4 years, with a new range of challenges and responsibilities and a new news agenda. And now I come back to the VLV in a new role, one I've been in for 1.5 years, as Group Director at Ofcom, with responsibility for overseeing the regulation of UK broadcasting. And once again, I have to say, I feel I'm in a decidedly privileged position, and I feel the responsibility of playing our part in a vibrant British media industry, one which has such an integral role at the heart of this country. And it is a unique job in that I'm lucky enough to have an overview of British broadcasting as a whole, where I get to speak to and sometimes challenge those running the media companies, those who ultimately make the critical decisions that directly affect what all of us as viewers see on screen or hear across the airwaves. It's a job where I have to say my experience has been through the commissioning of what I would say is world-class and in-depth research. We're able to truly understand what audiences think and feel about the media they consume. And we have the power to intervene on the behalf of the audiences if broadcasters are found wanting. And it's a job where I get to hear the welcome views of leading industry experts in forums such as today's spring conference. Your insights, and many of them were expressed this morning, are absolutely invaluable in driving forward and informing the debate about the future health and direction of UK broadcasting. And I would say, and it's not always a fashionable thing to say, but I think it's been illustrated by the awards, that in my view, the outlook for UK broadcasting is broadly good. We see remarkable creativity. That's the lifeblood running through the veins of the UK's media industry, and it is the best in class. But there are, as Sir David Clementi alluded to earlier on, of course, some well-known and significant tests that UK broadcasters must inevitably face and overcome. World-class media organisations here, facing both local and global challenges. And it's with the global context I'd like to begin before narrowing the focus and speaking about the BBC, our first year of regulating the BBC, which has just ended, and other UK broadcasters. So this is where I try and do the slides, if it's possible, the first one. Okay, here we go. So That is the overall worldwide spend on TV programs in 2017. That's $115 billion, or around 81 billion pounds. You'll see on that graph that North America accounts for over a third of that spend. That's the large blue section, with Western Europe overall a bit less than that at around $39 billion. But just remember that headline figure of global spend, 81 billion pounds. And then let's consider the UK in that overall context. The UK's total spend in 2016 was $11 billion, or around £8 billion, according to IHS Markit. And if you look at what the UK Public Service Broadcasters, don't worry, I'll try and go through this, it's quite a big graph, but if you look at what the UK's Public Service Broadcasters had to spend in that year, overall it was £2.9 billion, 2.9 billion from a world context of 80 billion. With the BBC as the biggest spender on 1.3 billion, ITV under $1 billion, Channel 4 £500 million, and Channel 5 around 200 million. In UK terms, that seems quite a lot. In global terms, as you can see, not so much, around 8%. To put it in context, the total PSB spend, less than Amazon and Netflix combined. And as we've seen in the past year or so, we're now in an age where global scale really matters. And Ofcom's had some involvement in some of those issues. In the States, we've seen Time Warner attempt an $85 billion merger with the already giant AT&T. Talks are seemingly on again between CBS and Viacom. And here, the Fox bid for Sky, then the Disney bid for Fox and Sky, and then the possible Comcast counterbid for Sky. Enormous companies saying they just are not big enough. And at the same time, various combinations of huge distribution and content production arms. So a total UK content spend of under £3 billion by the UK's public service broadcasters starts to look anything but big. Curiously, and this is my experience so far, this leaves an organisation like the BBC riding two very different horses. In the UK's media market, as you can see, the BBC remains a Goliath, dwarfing competitors in TV, radio, online and news production. The argument runs the BBC is simply too big and influential. But in an increasingly global marketplace, faced daily by the muscular Netflix and Amazon, as Sir David Clementi said, the BBC seems much smaller, often outmuscled over drama rights by the newer kids on the block. The BBC, like all of our public service broadcasters, is also facing a growing challenge from changing audience behaviours, driven by new technology and greater choice. This slide shows the steady shift away from live TV set viewing and the growth of on-demand consumption. You can see the light green bars at the bottom show a drop in the number of minutes of live broadcast TV from 2010 to 2017. From an average in 2010 of 225 minutes per person to 177 minutes in 2017. At the same time, you can see catch-up TV services in pink have risen from 9 minutes a day to 23 minutes a day, and subscription video on demand, like Netflix and Amazon, from 4 minutes a day to 24 minutes a day in just the last 5 years or so. And as you'll see, this is a projection of where that is likely to go in the next few years. And the projection is that the shift will only accelerate over the next few years. Underlying the speed of change is the more rapid shift away from live linear TV by younger audiences. We already know from our research at Ofcom that YouTube is more recognised as a brand than BBC One or ITV amongst 12 to 15-year-olds. And the fact that older audiences generally have adopted Netflix and Amazon later helps to sustain linear viewing. However, when older audiences do find Amazon and Netflix, they really like it. It's against this background of significant pressures on finances and audience shares that Ofcom is considering a number of policy areas, many of which have direct cost implications for public service and some commercial broadcasters. In particular, and there was some discussion of this morning, we're looking at the prominence of public service broadcasters, particularly on linear, but in other ways as well. And we'll soon consult on updates to the code governing electronic programme guides, EPGs. As you'll know, we're considering the future of children's television content, and we expect to publish our preliminary discussions of that review sometime this summer. And we're also focusing on the health of the production sector in the nations and regions as part of our review of the Made Out of London broadcaster guidelines, to understand just how effectively those guidelines are working in supporting the delivery of regional productions and programming in practice. As I say, there is a cost attached, potentially, to any intervention in those areas to the public service broadcasters and some commercial broadcasters. And we're very aware, we're looking at that against a background of falling revenues, advertising under pressure, and against a background, potentially, of legislation on HFSS food and drink, and any further restriction obviously would have a financial impact on commercial broadcasters here in the UK. I would say effective regulation is only part of the jigsaw, but we also consider, however, there's much that the UK broadcasters can do to help themselves. They've been pretty good, by and large, adapting for the digital age, and you can see lots of innovations across the BBC, Channel 4, and other broadcasters, whether that's investing in new methods of distribution, finding fresh ways to reach younger audiences by partnering with each other in some cases, and partnering with global competitors to share expertise, resources, and increase reach. And of course, they can help themselves by doing what they do best of all, which is to prioritise the making of original programmes that authentically portray modern lives across the UK. It's against this overall background that Ofcom has taken on regulation of the BBC. And I have to say, in my experience, I didn't realise this when I joined, but Ofcom wasn't exactly gagging to take on that task. In fact, it's almost exactly a year since Ofcom became the first independent regulator of the BBC in April 2017. Our responsibilities, as you'll know, are set out in the Charter and Agreement, which was debated by Parliament and the devolved administrations, in making sure that the BBC delivers on its mission and public purposes. As you'll also know, its mission is to act in the public interest, serving all audiences through the provision of impartial, high-quality and distinctive output and services which inform, educate and entertain. Its public purposes are to provide news and information, learning, to deliver high-quality and distinctive content, and to represent and serve the diverse communities of the UK. We approach regulating the BBC by considering our responsibilities in three key areas: the performance of the BBC, so how audiences value its services and content; the editorial standards of the BBC, including accuracy and impartiality; the protection of children, fairness and privacy; and the area of competition, to make sure that the BBC's market impact was justified by the public interest when the BBC is providing specific services. It's fair to say that having set up the framework to regulate the BBC, we've been pretty busy in all these areas so far. And naturally, many of the decisions we take are significant and high profile, unsurprisingly and rightly attracting widespread media coverage and often in generating intense public debate. Since I've arrived there, I've found that Ofcom has built its reputation on a number of pillars, and these have actually applied themselves well to our BBC work. We believe in delivering for the consumer, up to now, and now in this case, the audience. And that means truly getting under the skin of how viewers and listeners think and feel. They are at the heart of our regulatory approach. I mentioned earlier the work of our exceptional research team, who, as we speak, are busy assessing minute-by-minute programme analysis and conducting face-to-face interviews with viewers from across the UK to help us better understand whether the BBC adequately reflects and portrays the lives of people living in the nations and regions and the diverse communities that it is there to serve. We also believe in fair competition, which underpins vibrant markets. Here we believe a strong and creative BBC, alongside a range of successful and enabled commercially funded PSBs, and also alongside purely commercial media companies, will drive innovative content and distribution. We believe in transparency and accountability, and we've built those values into the way we regulate and the way we think that broadcasters that we regulate should also conduct themselves. The BBC, with its licence fee funding, has a particular responsibility in this area, in my view. I have focused largely on TV so far, But it would be totally remiss of me not to mention the UK's radio industry, which I think we're going to discuss later on. In the UK's radio industry, we see distinctive and popular public service radio sitting alongside some of the best, most ambitious and popular commercial radio stations in the world, who are performing very strongly financially, despite the various pressures they all face. And I do think, from the audience's point of view, it is fantastic that there's great competition. And if some people are disappointed about cricket going from the BBC, I think the history has been that sport on other channels can drive innovation and choice for listeners and viewers. I would like to finish on an upbeat note, having gone through all those challenges. I said a year ago in a newspaper article in The Telegraph that I think this is a golden age for UK broadcasting. It's something I firmly believe. The content is of a higher quality, range and ambition than we have ever seen. Editorial standards are very high. The world is brought to British audiences, and Britain is reflected to the world. Technology keeps breaking new ground. The quality and availability of what we watch, listen to and consume is extraordinary. And we have started to see some positive change, and now I think there is real momentum in how the broadcasters reflect and employ the peoples of the UK. And there's a renewed focus on areas where broadcasters still need to do better. The issue of the rights and pay of women and minority groups in the workforce have been properly and clearly raised, and media companies and regulators too, I may say, need to do better still. Companies are starting to work on being more socially inclusive and fair in the way they recruit, and have started to try and report the backgrounds that they recruit from. I'm in no means complacent. Broadcasters in this country face many challenges, and much work still needs to be done. But I am hopeful. It is our job at Ofcom to work with the broadcasters and on behalf of audiences to make sure that the range, quality, innovation, creativity, inclusivity and plurality of broadcasters is given the best possible platform for future success. And having the opportunity to have frank, open dialogue and debate and hear the views of industry experts, such as some of those here today in the room, is really invaluable in informing that work. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Kevin. I think in a shortish time that you've been given, it's really very hard to reflect the breadth of responsibilities that Ofcom carries. And the fact that, you know, now the biggest broadcaster in the UK is sort of grafted on to the model that was not set up for that purpose, I can only suspect is a pretty significant challenge within Ofcom. So thank you for your introductory words. Can everyone think about the questions they'd like to put to Kevin while I just throw a couple of my own at you? The first is I was struck by an article you wrote in The Telegraph last October, and you've now just repeated again about this being rather a golden age of broadcasting in the UK. But knowing that production has a tremendous time lag, other than news, obviously, I'm wondering if we're at a tipping point. If you add, you know, the BBC licence fee settlement to the slides we saw and the place of our broadcasters looking very minnow-like now in relation to, you know, the global players, do you think the current model of licence fee funded and commercial PSBs is sustainable?
So I have to say one of the tasks we're not relishing at Ofcom is to do the next review of PSBs, which we have to do next year. So we have to answer that question, and it will take a lot longer. But are we at a tipping point? I think it's always hard to see where there's a tipping point actually until you've gone past it. Looking around, I don't think so at the moment. I mean, yes, the BBC faces some funding challenges. I think a lot of organisations would be pretty happy with a certainty of funding for the next 5 years. They know what they have to deal with, and they're getting a rise in line with inflation. You know, going around talking to the commercial broadcasters, there are undoubtedly challenges, but you know, as I touched on in the speech, the way they are innovating, David Clementi touched on what the BBC is doing in terms of personalisation. I would say they're catching up with Channel 4, who were very early adopters of personalisation, and Channel 4 have got a fantastic product in all four. They are innovating. I think there are a number of challenges. I mean, one of them, to take one area we're looking at, is the area of prominence, which I think, again, Sir David talked about. But, you know, Ofcom has powers over linear prominence. We've been asked to look at, but we have zero powers over prominence of on-demand services. And, you know, going forward, that will be something that we raise in the consultation, something that we're looking at about, you know, as more and more people consume on demand, is that something that Parliament needs to consider about whether that is a new area that we need to have some say over prominence in?
It's interesting that, you know, we're picking up these themes of the difference between the regulated and the not in a whole variety of ways that is potentially going to impact, you know, going forward. Could I also pick up, you said and in your words about the reputation of Ofcom, one of the things that you pride yourselves on is transparency and accountability. And I know that there's quite a few VLV members who are concerned that the new model, really, of Ofcom regulating the BBC rather than the BBC Trust is kind of closing down some of the opportunities for engagement with licence fee payers. I'm wondering if you've got anything to say about, I mean, you've just said that there's face-to-face kind of research going on. I know from my experience that when you're in a role like yours, the players bombard you with evidence about their concerns. And I think it is terribly important that there's good avenues for learning at some length and thoroughness about views of the licence fee payer, because obviously it's a unique system where we all pay like it or not.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with you. I think exploring every best way to find out what the views of licence fee payers and the audience are is absolutely central to what we're doing. You know, one of the ways we're going to measure the performance of the BBC is we are doing a huge amount of and range of audience research, which we will publish in September, October, I think, as part of our annual review of the BBC. So that, and you know, that will be very transparent about what we've done to measure this and the way we've gone about it and the types of different research techniques we've used. I do agree. I mean, I've had these discussions with Colin and Sophie already about the concern about audience councils having disappeared. You know, so at Ofcom we do have advisory committees around the UK in each of the regions, which is a different way of getting people who are interested as members of the audience to have their input. I do spend a relatively large amount of time going around talking not just to stakeholders from in the industry, but other stakeholders as well, and trying to get to events like this. And I think we need to keep exploring. We are doing, you know, a number of focus groups, and those are ones that we, you know, I know we were doing a couple last night actually, which is looking at particular segments of the audience who are not self-selecting; they're selected by us, for us, by market research, so they're quite representative. And we're doing a lot of that around the UK, and particularly part of the work of our first annual review of the BBC and how it represents and portrays audiences of the UK. There is a huge amount of work going on where we're talking to a lot of small groups of the audience around the UK, geographically varied by background and so on. So we're very conscious of needing to find every best way. And I think if we get to the end of this is evolving. If we get to the end of year one and we don't think that's good enough, and there are other ways we need to do it, when it's not a closed shop.
Okay, you're open to suggestions.
We are constantly open to suggestions. Good. Yeah.
Right, I'll come to the floor now. Carol Tongue, and then Simon, and then you. Okay. Carol. It's probably best you say who you are.
Carol
yes.
Tongue, former MEP and European Coalitions for Cultural Diversity of Expression. You talked about powers to regulate on prominence. In Brussels, under discussion, nearly to be adopted, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive will give you the power to regulate online. on whether Netflix et al. Shall have 30% local production in their catalogue, and secondly, on prominence of local production in the strapline. Do you look forward to those new powers that you'll be able to exercise once that goes through?
So I was in Brussels last week talking to other European regulators and the European Commission about the exact powers of the AVMSD and when it might land. First of all, I don't think the timing is certain of when it's going to be adopted, because the trilogue is still going on, and as long as I've been in this job, I've been told it's going to be within the next few months, so we'll wait and see. There are some useful, I think there are some useful powers in that. I would question whether it gives us the powers to regulate online, actually. It gives us more powers over video sharing platforms, but that's as far as it goes. It doesn't give us any power over other online services. On the Netflix question, as you know, Netflix is already regulated by the Dutch authorities. It's based in Holland. So on country of origin, Netflix is already regulated.
Simon, yeah.
Simon Albury, Campaign for Broadcasting Equality. I was very glad to hear what you had to say about diversity of employment. But there's something I'm still waiting to hear. When I looked at the BBC annual plan for this year, in the diversity section, it led off with the BBC already has one of the most diverse workforces in the UK. Now, I remember the meeting you held on diversity on July the 13th last year. That statement was challenged, not just by me. And your chief executive said, oh, we'll ask the BBC for the underlying data, and we'll let you have it in the afternoon. Well, that was 10 months ago. So I'm wondering if you can tell me by what criteria the BBC already has one of the most diverse workforces in the UK.
So, Simon, this is part of an ongoing dialogue, which I'm grateful for, by the way. And can I just say, I think the pressure that you and others have applied has caused quite a lot of movement, both in our thinking, but also in the behaviour of broadcasters. So thank you for that. In terms of employment figures, as you know, we are doing the most comprehensive survey of UK broadcasters across TV already in terms of diversity. So the facts are there and they're published annually by us. We did the first one last year and it's been a very useful tool. There were areas that some broadcasters didn't have enough facts in, which we told them. We're publishing the second one on TV sometime over the summer. As you know, we're also now doing the first one ever on diversity of employment in radio, which will also be a very powerful tool. We've just had back most of the information. We've had to chase up quite a few radio stations. We will publish that approximately the same time in the autumn. These tools will say for certain where the BBC ranks alongside other broadcasters in many different areas. Now, as David Clementi said this morning, the BBC is not doing well enough in senior management from diverse backgrounds, as he said himself. I think the more information we put out there, the BBC's own commitments are quite strong in terms of what they've committed to by 2020, and they match up pretty well to Channel 4 and other broadcasters who are best in class. And we will track the way the BBC moves towards delivering those targets, and we'll do that in an open, transparent way, and part of that will be publishing the information, which the power, in my view, of information and transparency so that it cuts through rhetoric is one of the best things we can do.
Can I just follow up quickly on that before I come to you? Are you and the BBC agreed on the criteria for measuring things like diversity? Because I think I read that you came up with one figure and they came up with another in terms of employment. And I mean, for organisations like us or the general public or licence fee payer, that's massively confusing. Is the scope for having an agreed set of criteria?
So what we said to the BBC, so there was some disagreement last week. It was last year. It was mainly about timing, actually, which is the information that we put in the report to try and make it comparable to other broadcasters. Was published around the same time the BBC published their latest up, so there was a disparity there. We've had talks to try and iron that out so that there isn't two lots of information. It's about the timing, having the most up-to-date information, but also giving everybody, the broadcasters and audiences, the most comparable information between all broadcasters, and that's what we've absolutely tried to do. So there have been issues, and there's still one or two things we are ironing out, not just with the BBC, with other broadcasters, because we want a comparable set of information. There is no point in having information where you can't look at it alongside all the other broadcasters and see who's doing better and who isn't.
Yes, it's meaningless if it isn't genuine.
It is. You need a PhD to interpret it.
This gentleman down here, and then you, and then at the back, and I'm coming over that side in a bit.
Mark Galloway, VLV member, and I'm from the International Broadcasting Trust. I mean, one of the great strengths of PSB in the UK is not that it's not over-dominated by the BBC, that we have Channel 4, we have Channel 5, and we have ITV. But when you look at children's content, UK-made children's content, it's appalling. There's very little being made other than by the BBC. Do you think that situation is tenable?
So, as I say, this is one area we were asked by the Digital Economy Bill to review the future of children's content. You're absolutely right. The BBC does a huge amount actually in this area, and we baked it into the operating licence that we expect them to carry on doing that. So it's there as a requirement from Ofcom. It is an issue for sure amongst other broadcasters. It's complicated. I mean, I can't preempt what we're going to say, and we're going to put it out to public consultation when we do say something on it. But we've been doing a lot of work looking at what all the broadcasters do. There are some other really good examples. I think Channel 5 are here in the room, and they actually do a significant amount of voluntary number of hours of children's content and are pretty committed to it. Other broadcasters tackle it in different ways and target different age groups amongst children, because it's not just one homogenous group, it's different age groups. And Channel 4, for example, have a responsibility with older children, as we know. It's not, it isn't rosy across the piece. There are issues for the commercially funded public service broadcasters, which is you make very little return on children's content. You can't sell it in the same way you can drama or lots of factual or Blue Planet or whatever, especially if it's UK, if it's kind of UK portrayal children's content is not very interesting to sell to any of the overseas broadcasters. So it is difficult to fund. My concern is, so for ITV and Channel 4, there are quite a lot of requirements as part of their licenses for being public service broadcasters, and you always have to weigh that up with what are the benefits of being a public service broadcaster, and look at it in the overall scheme of things as how they're competing with the Netflix and so on we've already touched on. And we've got to be quite careful, I think, about continually loading new requirements onto PSBs when the benefits, for example, of being on Freeview or free-to-air TV is diminishing over time. Because, it's quite open to some of these companies in the end to walk away and say, do you know what, we're not going to be PSBs anymore. So it's about being a bit nuanced in looking at the requirements we put. That's not to say there isn't an issue about other suppliers of children's content. The other thing I would say is people tend to focus on children's TV content, and the market has changed dramatically in the last few years. As anyone with kids or grandkids would know, linear content for kids is becoming less and less popular all the time, and many kids are going to YouTube or Netflix or many other sources to get their content, looking on iPads, on other devices, on mobiles. So, the tide is moving away from children's eyeballs on linear content at the moment. So these are all the things we're considering in trying to give a view overall of what are kids doing and what really are the realistic requirements we might put, if any, on the broadcasters beyond what they already do.
Okay, I'm coming to the gentleman right at the back and then to you. Yes, there.
Thank you, Robert Beveridge, VLV. So let's see if I've got this right. Some years ago, Ofcom tightened up the regulations on high-fat, salt and sugar foods. Okay? So then the advertising disappears, and then ITV pull away from children's programming. So then the BBC gets criticised because it's too big. And then what happens is the BBC licence fee then gets top-sliced in order to pay for children's programming. And I think we've seen a similar direction of travel with ITV moving away from non-news regional programming, and everything gets loaded on the BBC. So what I want to ask you is, will you please call the bluff of some of these ITV companies? If they don't want to be PSB, fair enough. But what I would like is a level playing field with the BBC treated in the same way as these other broadcasters.
So I'm not quite sure I would agree with the total causality of your argument. I certainly would agree with those different events. I'm not sure they're all directly linked to each other. It is not a level playing field for the BBC and other broadcasters, because the BBC gets 3.7 billion of public funding every year, and therefore they have a unique set of responsibilities that are set for them in the Charter and Agreement by Parliament. So it is never going to be a level playing field for the BBC. The BBC is always going to have a range of commitments that they have to do, and they should be doing, which the commercially funded PSBs don't. That's not to say the PSBs do have a range of commitments, and their licences are not up for another few years, so they will continue to have those commitments unless the licences are varied.
Mr. Bakhurst, that was a very informative talk. David Lass, a long-time VLV member, I sent you an email in advance with some questions. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it yesterday, but I'll quote the points are, how can individual members submit complaints? Now, I mentioned that over a year ago I had talked to your colleague, Mr. Tony Close, Director of Content Standards, and I'd submitted several complaints to the BBC under its old structure from 2014 to 2017 regarding their coverage of terrorism in Israel, Europe and the UK. And he said that because it's all been rejected, I would now be entitled to submit a separate complaint to Ofcom under the new code. Now, is there procedures? I did look at the website, but it was a bit confusing. As an individual, can I submit a complaint to Ofcom quoting the evidence of my previous experience regarding what is considered lack of partiality of BBC News, bearing in mind the new codes and responsibilities? So are there procedures for individuals who submit complaints on those grounds?
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, I did get your email, and I had a look at it. I also discussed it with our editorial standards team to see if they'd had anything from you subsequently, yes. Which they can't find a record of. So yes, the procedure is absolutely for individuals. If you have complained to the BBC and they've either rejected your complaint, or even if they've accepted it, but if they've rejected it in your case, it is totally open to you to bring your complaints to Ofcom, and that is the procedure. People need to go to the BBC first, which apparently you have done. You can go to our website, and on the website, I think it's relatively clear, you can say, I have complained to the BBC, they rejected it, this is what I want to complain about, and here's the documentation. So you are totally free to come to us with the complaints you have, and we'll consider them like we do for every individual. Okay. And if you can't, sorry, I was just going to say, if you find the website confusing, we can try and give you some help in how to fill that out.
Thank you for that. Vincent and Sylvia, and then back to Peter York.
Thank you. I'm Sylvia Harvey. I'm University of Leeds and a VLV trustee. I know it's really difficult to ask you to talk about new regulatory powers, because that's not your job, really. I appreciate that, but I'm going to come round to that.
Go ahead.
Yes. You've done excellent work on child safety on the internet. And we heard this morning from Damien Collins some extraordinary ideas, really. I mean, unprecedented talk about fundamentally new issues to do with freedom of speech and electoral law. Just to give two examples on electoral law, the fact that during an election period, if you're handing out a leaflet for a party, the leaflet has got to have on it a name or a party so that you know where the information is coming from. Well, on the internet, we've had example after example of people not knowing the source of the information. In respect of free speech, profound concept, goes back 200 years. And we sort of take for granted that freedom of speech means freedom of speech by human beings. Not in the swift world of horses speaking. We're talking about human beings having freedom of speech. But a bot comes along, and does a bot have freedom of speech? So really, there are things changing in a profound and fast way. And given that you are the specialist, you can't write your own rules, but you are the specialist, and you have more time to think about these things than parliamentarians do, really. And the speech given this morning by Damien Collins I found quite extraordinary for the level of concern about what is going on now that will require parliamentary intervention. So if you'd really, I'm sorry, I know it's a rough question to ask, but perhaps there might be one or two things you might like to say about
Sure.
concern.
Sure.
There might need to be new kinds of regulation.
Thanks, Sylvia.
Yeah, no, it's very much the point. So I don't think it's giving any state secrets to say we have been doing a lot of thinking within Ofcom about this issue. We can see the audience concern about illegal content online and also about disinformation and fake news. And frankly, a lot of the areas we've covered are the sort of ones that Damien Collins went over in his speech today. We've also been talking to our European colleagues, and I said I was in Brussels last week. Part of that was talking, in fact, the whole of that day was talking about what European regulators and the European Commission are doing around this area. And some have done more than others, as Damien mentioned. The Germans in particular have gone quite far. I don't think they're totally comfortable with how it's all working, but they have certainly gone out on a limb and have gone quite far in this area. So yeah, we have been doing a lot of thinking about it. It's still work in progress. We've been talking to a lot of stakeholders and doing a lot of research, audience research about it. And we have been thinking about if Parliament decided there was a need for regulation in the online space, what could that look like, which would safeguard as far as possible human freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but which would provide safeguards and transparency to make it altogether sort of safer place, if you like. So the answer is yes, we have been doing a lot of thinking about it. We still have, in my view, another couple of months before, or another few months before it's going to be fully finalised. I was pleased Damien didn't mention it. I was meant to go to his committee a month ago, and I got bumped by one of the Cambridge Analytica people who appeared. So, but I am meant to be going back in May, so I suspect we'll be asked about it again when I go back in May. But that's the answer: is that we are thinking about it. We're certainly not putting in a job application, but it is an area where we have considerable parallel type experience in broadcasting standards. That's not to say the regime should look or would look the same, but there are a lot of lessons you can learn from doing that as to how it might work.
Right, thank you. I've got a few queuing up. So Vincent, then Peter York, and then you. Thank you.
Vincent Porter. You showed some figures which showed the decline in viewing time for television, and I think a very slight increase in the viewing time for online material. Do you think it would be possible to start to break that down by programme genre? Because I think if you were able to, A, it would help the broadcasters, but B, it might also help you as regulators.
Yeah, I think we probably have quite a bit of that already available, actually. It might be useful for us to think about putting it out more clearly if we haven't put it out already. And I think we already know that some of the genres are much more popular in on-demand, such as drama, than, for example, sport and news and current affairs, which is primarily live-driven. But I'll mention that to the audience team, whether it might be useful to try and give that breakout more clearly next time we publish figures on this in this area.
Yeah, in that summer report you do, that could be very, very useful, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Susan Stranks, a long-term member of the Voice of the Listener and Viewer and campaigner for children's publicly funded radio and content in general. I have to say, with respect to Ofcom, I was very against the BBC being given to Ofcom as the regulator, both the burden and the privilege. Because as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Ofcom has hitherto anyway been largely funded by the licenses and regulating the licenses that it awards to the commercial sector. Now that lays it open to huge pressure from the commercial sector, for whom I worked for years and years, but who have their own vested interests. How is Ofcom going to pay equal respect to those lobbyists and the BBC as a public service broadcaster?
Well, I think it's a valid point. I mean, a lot of our funding comes from the mobile operators and broadband operators who would not necessarily have a dog in the fight, though they might do. All I can do is I can absolutely reassure you 100% that we operate totally independently, whether that is independently of who funds us, and they have no choice, by the way, so they can't withdraw their funding. That is decided by Ofcom, so they can't threaten to reduce the funding if we don't come out with favourable outcomes to them. But we operate 100% independently of commercial operators and of the BBC and of government. And I wouldn't be in this job if I didn't believe in doing that, because that's the way I've always operated. When I was in BBC News, that's the way I operated. We were independent of government, independent of vested interests. And, look, if you see me leave in a rush, you'll know why. But I mean, that has not been my experience so far. And Sharon White is fiercely independent. And that's one of the reasons when I met her, I decided I'd take the job because I like that.
Thank you. Peter.
Peter York, the Media Society. Can you enforce, by which I mean publicise and monitor your judgments? What I'm thinking of here, I'm thinking of Saving Serious Children, which was one of the most egregious libels. In any other situation, it would be considered a libel. Fantastic libel. I don't know whether everybody knows about it. The suggestion that an edition of Panorama in 2013 was entirely faked to suggest that Assad had done, surprise, surprise, a chemical weapons attack. And it was widely suggested that this was entirely faked in a sort of filmic fashion. Ofcom came to the judgment that it wasn't. That libel is constantly repeated. I could take you to sites now and show you its repetition. I heard it on a stage in Bloomsbury Baptist Church last October. How do you sit on that? Or isn't it your job? And if it isn't your job, whose job is it? Because it's very, very current and important.
So I think it is a wider issue than Ofcom's judgments. I think, there are a lot of false and ridiculous stories that circulate on the internet or word of mouth or whatever. And it is very hard, apart from if they break the law, they're libelous or whatever, it's very hard for them to be enforced. And I think that's one of the issues society faces at the moment. I don't think it's either within our gift or our powers to enforce. We make a judgment, how people interpret that and what they say about it, it's up to them. If people are libeling individuals, then it's up to the individuals or their organisations to take action against the people who are doing that. The one thing I would say about, say, Syria's children and allegations about fakery of that kind of stuff is we have made 1 or 2 findings against broadcasters who allege that. They were published by Ofcom. They had, in some instances, I think, to read out corrections on air. And the BBC, if they want to, can... and I think this, across the piece, actually is one good argument about having an independent regulator. If there's an editorial issue that the BBC have dealt with, but not to someone's satisfaction, it comes to Ofcom, and Ofcom, as the independent regulator, takes a view on it. If Ofcom finds in favour of the BBC can stand up and say, do you know what, you went through our process and you went through Ofcom's process, and Ofcom is the independent regulator and they supported our judgment. Now, in some cases, we won't support the BBC's judgment, but on this kind of story, we did come out and say that was a false report about Syria's children or whatever it was, and that gives power to the BBC or to other broadcasters who've gone through Ofcom who say, do you know what, you've gone through the independent regulator and they found in our favour. And I think that's one of the strengths of having an independent regulator that looks at these items totally impartially. And if you come out in favour of the broadcaster, which you don't always do.
Right. At the back there, thank you. We've got only about 5 minutes to go, so if you want
It's
to...
Rini Bravo, member of the VLV. In this current fashion for diversity, are we perhaps losing the important thing in a broadcaster, the quality of their verbal institution?
Do you totally understand the
question? I do totally understand the question. Look, I think it's up to the broadcasters to look at the quality of how people are broadcasting, whatever background they come from. I don't think it's a fashion. I think it's just the right thing to be doing. And I think the BBC particularly, which is publicly funded, but all the broadcasters know they need to be representative of the UK society as a whole, and that doesn't mean everyone speaks in a particular way. There are a lot of regional accents and a lot of diverse accents. You know, there may be a slight cost to some people who find some accents harder to understand, but you know, in the end, broadcasters have got to maintain a quality. They've got to choose people from whatever background who can broadcast well. And, you know, we just saw Michelle Hussein, and I don't think you can find a better example of someone who is a fine broadcaster from a diverse background.
It's true, very true. Can I ask a slightly nerdy regulatory question, or governance question? Now you've got the, you know, responsibility of dealing with the BBC. Is that a matter reserved to the Ofcom main board, or is it delegated to the content board, or is it somewhere between the two?
So, so the executive takes, you know, suggests most of the policy decisions. Yeah. There is a governance process. Either it goes, is slightly nerdy, or probably won't be of that much interest, but the main decisions would normally go to the content board for discussion with some non-exec members, but that is for their opinion. It's not decisive, and it would then the big decisions would go to the board, either for noting or for discussion at the board. So, and there are members, Nick Pollard's here, who, you know, are members of both boards, the content board and the main board. But so. On editorial issues, the content board plays a significant role in terms of advising us around editorial standards issues, and that's one of the main roles of the content board. Those standards issues don't tend to go to the main board at all.
All right. The
is that fair, Nick?
Picking up again the theme about, you know, accountability and having some dialogue with licence fee payers. I mean, one of the things I think is quite difficult is to track, you know, where Ofcom is on certain things that are of interest to audiences like this. For example, in preparing for this, and I know this isn't your responsibility, the last set of content board minutes that are on the website are from last October. So I think I would make a plea on behalf of those who want to try and follow, whether it's the, you know, children's review or the EPG review, that there's a means of tracking where you are on certain of these issues and knowing when it might be, you know, worthwhile coming in for a conversation.
Yeah, no, I'll try it. I mean, I'll try and, first of all, I'll ask them to put the more recent content board minutes up. No, I think you're quite right. I think we try to be pretty open about timetables and where we are on certain things when we say there's going to be a consultation, say on children's, when the consultation's going to be and what the timetables are and what the submissions are. And we even publish virtually all the submissions unless they're commercially sensitive. So, you know, I think if we're not being transparent enough in particular areas, we should be more.
And I don't know whether anyone here in the audience is following, you know, the spectrum issues and the future of digital terrestrial television, which is another concern of VLV. I don't know whether there's anything you can update us on about how Ofcom are approaching those spectrum issues, which might impact both in viewing and financial terms, potentially on UK viewers.
So it's one of the, when I had my first round of meetings, when I first took the job, with most broadcasters, exactly one of the issues that they asked about was the future of free-to-air and spectrum availability for that. There was a piece of work going on looking at freeing up spectrum, which we are obliged to do. The conclusion actually internally a few months ago was that the spectrum needed for Freeview would almost certainly not have to be freed up in the next 10 years. And my view, which I expressed quite strongly within Ofcom, which actually people agreed with, was let's put that out publicly, which Sharon did in her speech on PSBs, which says, you know, we think, you know, barring unforeseen circumstances, that Freeview will be here probably the next 10 years, and the spectrum will not be allocated to other things because we understand for lots of reasons, not least of which is universality, Freeview remains very important. Now, I think it's harder for us to say beyond that, and frankly, that doesn't mean to say that broadcasters shouldn't be looking at other ways of distributing, because Freeview, you know, probably is quite time limited when audiences are using so many different devices and broadband is getting more and more available.
Okay. Well, I think we're coming up to our time. I'd like to thank Kevin very warmly for the breadth of issues that you've had to tackle and the seriousness with which you've treated the questions. And I think as someone who had a brief sojourn in Ofcom quite a few years ago now, I don't envy you the additional issues that are now crowding in on your agenda. It's a very complex job that the organisation has to do, and thank you for taking time away from the office, not just for this, but for attending all this morning's sessions as well. So would you join me in thanking Kevin?
Is it 4 chairs? These all
5.
5. Okay.
Smooth at all.
I'm sorry. Should do actually.
I can put somebody at this end. It would really
Do you
help.
want me to?
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. I like that to smooth.
I'd rather know that that's the kind of person who's doing that job.
Jillian's chair this. Good. Yes. Jillian, if you can go that end, that would be great. Thank you. And then I don't know if there is everyone else. It probably doesn't matter really. I'll just get you some more water and some more glasses.
That would be really nice.
It's cooler in here at least.
Yes, it's good in here.
Yeah.
Snuggling up.
We're
Nick.
very
It's all cozy, I'm afraid, yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid you are fine. I think you are a bit cramped. I apologise. What
about Matt?
You're all good friends.
Don't worry about it, Siobhan. We're going to get fairly close here.
That's nice, Nick. I
Yeah,
can't do
that's
anything better.
There we go.
Right.
Bless you.
Commercial radio
Bless
at its
you.
best.
Well done, Sophie.
Thank you. I'll turn this off.
It's cooler in here than it is outside.
It's lovely in here.
It's a micro.
I agree with that. Sorry. Very nice in here.
I think so. We'll make it
Thank
work
you.
somehow.
You know that.
Oh, hi. Hello, sir. Right. Hello.
Oh, yes.
Tony, have you got the slide?
Okay, if we settle down for the
Are you standing up?
final session of the afternoon, if we're all ready. Just give everybody a moment or two to settle. Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'll just introduce the chair of this, what promises to be a very stimulating session, Jillian Reynolds. Now, I have to begin with an apology because reading the Biogsnot paper, it would seem to suggest that Jillian had been a radio journalist for 50 years. That can't possibly be true.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true. And only half of the story.
Well, perhaps we'll hear the other half. But Jillian is obviously an extraordinarily distinguished journalist who, at this stage of her career, has made a career change from one newspaper to another, and best of luck in the new role, Jillian.
Yeah.
And really pleased that you're joined us for this session, so it's over to you now.
Thank you very much, Colin. Now, I'm going to start with you. Valiant survivors of a very taxing day. Now, how many of you listen to any radio today? Very good. How many listen to commercial radio? 1, 2, 3, 4. Not bad. Not bad. No. I'm Colin Brown. Very good. Very good. Now, 9 out of 10 of us listen every week, as you know. We listen for over 1 million hours a week between us. The audience is, Siobhan will correct me if I'm wrong, roughly split between commercial radio and all commercial radio and BBC radio. Yes, that's about right, isn't it? And we have radio listening is something that television would die for. You heard in the last presentation how audiences are dribbling away from television as it is. Well, they may be dribbling away from radio too, but the audience hours figures are still outstanding. The new Radar audience ratings will be out in a couple of weeks. So radio's still alive, but it is changing. Now, there's a big announcement yesterday. Key 103 in Manchester announced that on June the 4th, it will transform itself from Key 103 and become Hits, is that its name?
Yep, Hits Radio.
Hits Radio, the nation's newest national digital station and the only national station broadcasting from Manchester. Now, that station is owned by one of commercial radio's 2 big operators, Bauer. And is this an indication of radio growing or consolidating, or just responding to sociological change? One reason radio is still there is that it's kept pace with technology. You can hear it in mono, stereo, surround sound, if you've got all those speakers. You can have it delivered to you in individual servings, in podcasts. You don't even need a radio set anymore. You can get it on your phone or a tablet or one of those new devices that you're so keen on, Siobhan, as in Alexa, play Classic FM. Any of you got one of those digital thingies that you give it? Yes.
Not that one, but lots of others.
Lots of others. You've got one of those that respond and say, do it.
Yes, but
so,
not one of not
no,
Amazon.
The guy behind you's got the one that does it all. Good.
Tells jokes.
And tells jokes.
They're pretty lame though, aren't they, those jokes?
Book it immediately. Book it immediately. So the internet also is unfolding infinitely before you. But more people will listen to you if you're actually on the radio. Let's get specific now. What are the challenges that commercial radio faces? What kinds of public service radio does commercial radio provide? What would the public miss if, a mere 5 years hence, commercial radio in the UK passed away quietly on its 50th birthday in October 2023? Yes?
Yeah.
How do you say it? 2023?
Yeah, 2023.
2023. I'm not very good with hard sums, as anyone can tell you. Now, let me introduce you. You've got excellent notes, by the way, in your programs. But I'm just going to add a personal note to all of these. Over here is Nick Ferrari, journalist and broadcaster. He works for the other big group in commercial radio, Global, and they own, as well as LBC, Capital, Classic FM, and many a big city station, Manchester significantly among them. He is the commercial broadcaster most often quoted these days on BBC Radio News. And this morning, he even got Michael Gove to answer a straightforward question. It was about data disposal. And the unique and seldom heard answer, especially from Mr. Gove, was, I don't know.
True. Thank you, Julie.
And next to him is Matt Deakin. The BBC long ago gave up radio expressly made for children. Here's someone who believes that there's still a significant audience. And if you can't answer your grandchildren's questions about what is snot, or why your poo might turn green, or why volcanoes erupt, get them to take the weekly Fun Kids Science podcast. It's meant for listeners.
Yeah, so sort of 7 to 12-year-olds. Yes.
7 to 12. Yes. Alfred Reynolds is coming up to 4, but I think he's ready for the snot bulletin. On my immediate left is Siobhan Kenny. Now, she's someone who's worked in 10 Downing Street, when Alistair Campbell ran Tony Blair's press office. So she's a woman who understands challenges. This is extremely handy, seeing that as she's the Chief Executive Officer of the body that represents collectively the interests of commercial radio, and she has to represent them to business, to government, and to the public at large. I have to tell you, from behind the scenes, she wouldn't tell you this, but I can. The challenge of getting her regiment to march in step is formidable. And here is Tony Stoller. Now, I know Tony Stoller longer than I've known anyone else on this table. I know he read law at Cambridge. I also know that his first job afterwards was as promotion manager at the Liverpool Daily Post and Echo. Now, that was when I worked at Radio City. That was in the bit where I worked in commercial radio between The Guardian and The Telegraph. And one of my brilliant ideas that I tried to sell him was doing a joint collaborative promotion of Spot the Ball on the radio. He turned me down flat. And as you will see from the CV that you have, he's not only run radio stations, he's worked in retail, he's regulated every single segment of commercial radio. You represented the industry at the old AIRC, yes? And then you moved to the Radio Authority, and then the Radio Authority, you moved to the IBA, and the IBA became the Radio Authority, and then you eased into Ofcom. Is that right? Is that the sequence of events? Tony is going to tell you the history, and nobody can move, or you're not allowed tea afterwards. Tony.
Well done, Jillian.
Jillian, thank you, and good afternoon. I'm a media historian these days, so I'm really just here to plug my book, which you can buy outside, which is The History of Classical Music Radio in the UK, in which commercial radio features very significantly. I'm here to give you a quick sketch of commercial radio in this country. It's been around ever since the start. The companies that formed the original British Broadcasting Company were commercial companies. They were radio set manufacturers who wanted to be able to sell radios, and therefore they needed something to be broadcast. As early as 1931, stations like Radio Normandy, Radio Luxembourg were beaming into the UK, and had it not been for the Second World War, it's perfectly imaginable that that sort of commercial radio would have happened much earlier domestically. The Panzer divisions in 1940, rolling across the plains of northern France, put a stop to that. But commercial radio remained in the form of Radio Luxembourg post-war. I suspect, looking at my contemporaries around here, there are those of us who smile nostalgically about Radio Luxembourg. The Ovaltinis, Horace Batchelor, thank you very much. Its impact on British broadcasting was significant. The legacy from Radio Luxembourg into ITV, not just programmes, double your money, take your pick, but also this style of popular television was something which influenced ITV. Then, of course, you had a pause. The only commercial radio which was around for Britain was Radio Luxembourg under the bedclothes 208. ITV flourished, the BBC became obsessed with television, and probably that would have been that for a while had it not been for Ronan O'Reilly, the proprietor of Radio Caroline, who on Easter Sunday 1964, why would an Irishman choose to challenge the British establishment on Easter Sunday, I wonder? On Easter Sunday 1964, launched Radio Caroline on Mi Amigo, to be followed by Radio London and many other imitators. And for 3 years, unabashed commercial radio came into this country, and it was received with enormous enthusiasm. It caught the zeitgeist of young people, transistor radio, youth affluence, and had therefore to be shut down by the wonderfully named Marine, etc. Broadcasting Offences Act of 1967. But the toothpaste was out of the tube. Radio Caroline and Radio London begat Radio 1 and BBC Radio 2. More than that, they led to the breaking of the BBC's radio monopoly in 1973, 8th of October, 73. with the introduction of independent local radio, a tightly regulated, advertising-funded service of local radio, pop music based, but it broke the monopoly. And the idea then, which is unfashionable now, was that the electromagnetic spectrum was a public resource which should not only be used for private profit, but also for public service. So for many years after 1973, the independent local radio stations provided an old-fashioned form of public service radio alongside their more contemporary popular music base, and that influence carried through. And so when in the early 90s, independent national radio, national commercial radio, was added to the mix, Classic, Virgin, Talk Radio UK, as it then was, these stations inherited that mix of the BBC heritage of a public service, commercially based set of radio stations. And that is the context in which contemporary commercial radio exists. We now have larger groups, 20 years, gosh, there's a fair thought for conglomerated groups. We have national commercial radio as networks of local stations, as well as national commercial radio stations in themselves. And my last point of history before I sit down at the end of my 5 minutes, I think I'm on time, is digital audio broadcasting, DAB, digital radio, launched in the late 1990s, technology of the last century, but part of the historical pattern which leads to what we see now. Commercial radio embraced digital audio broadcasting as much as did the BBC. And so what you see today in commercial radio, which those who practice it will talk about, is something that goes right back to 1922, that is mediated through the European influence rather than the American influence of commercial radio pre-war, which survived the arrival of ITV as radio flourished, as Jillian has just said, came through in that curiously British amalgam of commercial but not entirely commercial, burst through digital radio, and is now where you are going to say it is.
Thank you, Tony. Now, Siobhan, take us through where we are and where we're going.
Well, fascinating, Tony, to hear the history of the development of commercial radio as we come up to, 45 years now. It always seemed to me when I started at Radio Centre only 4 years ago that I couldn't really believe it had only been around for 40 years. It seemed odd to me that the BBC had a monopoly up till then, but of course, Tony puts it in slightly more context. Well, we've all got 5 minutes, and Jillian's very strict, I know that, and I'm quite frightened of her, and I'm sitting next to her. So I can't really talk about the many, many things I'd like to today. So I'd like to concentrate on 3 challenges and opportunities that we face now based on the very helpful background that Tony's just given. So first, I want to talk about trust, second, about diversity, and thirdly, about collaboration and what the new world means for us in the world of radio, really, with all the opportunities that new technology has brought. So trust, I'm sure you've been talking about that today already. I know Damien Collins was here, so you obviously will have been talking about Facebook and everything else that delivered. We at Radio Centre have had an opportunity to observe the debate in live terms over the last 3 weeks since we share a building with Cambridge Analytica.
Whoa!
I'll have to say the paparazzi have not been outside waiting to talk to me, but for various of our colleagues. To the extent that the doorman has now taken their nameplate off the building because people were just coming along to take photos and go, is this where all the bad stuff happens? Well, we didn't comment, but, maybe we would. So we decided to, I just want to check this is working. Maybe it's not working. Is it? There it is. So in the context of trust, we know that radio is a very trusted medium. So we wanted to actually do some research that brought that out, particularly with commercial radio. So here's the report, Breaking News, that we published just quite in a timely fashion in November last year. With the help of a very major broadcaster, Nick Ferrari, we launched it in the House of Commons last November. And one of the questions we asked over 1,000 people who listen to commercial radio mainly, but all radio, is how much do you trust these various forms of media? And of course, it's no surprise to all of us, but look how high television and radio are on that chart. You know, the regulated industries, people really trust what they hear in terms of news on those bulletins that they hear all day, every day, and look how far down that list social media is as well. So there's something really interesting going on there. People do consume it a lot, social media, but they're not necessarily believing everything that they hear. So this is kind of timely for Damian Collins's, for his committee's investigation, also for the government who are thinking about regulating now. If you look at how people are actually feeling about the various media that they consume. We also asked them about radio, in particular, about commercial radio in particular. What do they use it for? Why is it particularly valuable? And for them, it's about short, punchy bulletins. It's about getting the news really quickly at certain times of the day. So it's in the morning, it's in the car, and when they really use it is during local emergencies. So hard to imagine on a day when it's so hot, but during the recent snow period, you want to see the ratings for local commercial radio absolutely massive, both, you know, online and offline. So that's the reasons why people continue to engage with commercial radio, continue to value it so highly. And I guess in terms of that, it's a very good complementary medium to the BBC. I mean, I'm sure you'll hear us sparring with the BBC every now and then, but I think commercial radio provides a valuable plurality, which governments certainly do recognise as well. So on that, I think we also... Sorry, it's been a little bit slow. So we're also looking at public value. So what does commercial radio deliver? It's very easy to think it's only the BBC that delivers public service broadcasting as such. But of course, look at the reasons why people listen to their local radio stations. It's about local news, it's about community news, it's about local quizzes, local knowledge. So our recent research shows that across the networks, you'll find 13 and a half hours every week of public service broadcasting across commercial radio networks. And so I think it's just an interesting fact, because often you overlook it when you're thinking about what's on commercial radio. And talking about plurality, again, I think let's look at the audiences we broadcast to. I'm not making BBC bashing points here, but I think it's very interesting that we have a bigger audience among Black, Asian, minority, ethnic audiences, and also, by the way, in what used to be called C2s, Ds and Es, but lower socioeconomic, if you like, the ITV sort of audience. So we are expanding the kind of knowledge of a bigger audience, and I think that really plays to the strength of radio in general. So we're doing something slightly different from the BBC, and that's why 90% of the population still listen to radio every week. And I suppose coming on to that, it's really a point about collaboration. So it's easy to characterise the BBC and commercial radio being at each other's throats about audience share and reach, and of course you'll hear us doing that. But actually far more interesting in this world where we've got lots of new technologies, lots of new ways to play, but lots of new competitors as well, is that we are united in our joint love of radio and audio. And when we do work together with things like Radio Player, fantastic technological project funded by the BBC and commercial radio together, which is now, by the way, in 8 countries across the world, and we're selling into more, then we really, really do hit our peak. So I think when we work together, we're really strong, and we're going to be doing a lot more of that.
Small footnote, audience research.
Yes.
You cooperate with BBC.
Radar as well, yeah, it's another way in which we do. So again, differentiator from the social media platforms who claim all sorts of extravagant figures in viewing and all the rest of it, on the back of which they sell advertising. We have proper, verified, third-party data on audience measurement, and I think that's a really valuable differentiator.
Thank you, Siobhan. Now, as I introduce Matt, I'm just going to make a small comment about proliferation of sources. I've got one of the original DAB tuners. So I thought, I can find it on there. So I can find Fun Kids here. Could I find it? I went through it yesterday. But I'd had lunch with someone and a couple of other people who was in this room. And I wasn't exactly at my sober best when I was looking yesterday. But I looked today, sober best. I couldn't find it. Then good advice. You should have been by my side. I went to the website and I listened off the website, which is how I know about the snot and the volcanoes. But as what I did find in my extensive trawling along the DAB offer is all these, I didn't know we had the first Russian-speaking station, Matryoshka Radio in London. I found Tamil services, several. I found many language services that I didn't know were there. Because like most people, I just usually go to the stations that I know. So Matt, now I've found you,
Yes.
I will not let you go in the words of the song. So on you go.
Okay, I'm going to stand so I can just see the screen up here. Hey, so my name's Matt Deakin. As Jillian said, I run a children's radio station called Fun Kids, but also I work as a radio consultant working for different operators around Europe. And radio is incredibly healthy. 48.8 million people in the UK listen to some form of radio each week, 38 million of them on analogue radio, and 33 million of them on digital radio.
That's interesting.
And when we talk about the amount they listen and what they listen to, it kind of breaks down into 4 groups. So listening on AM and FM radio, listening on DAB radio, listening through your television, and listening on the internet or maybe through a mobile phone. And at the moment, if you take all of the listening in the UK, just over half of it, 50.1%, is listened to on analogue radio. And then 3 figures are on the 3 other platforms. Does anybody want to guess which one is DAB, which one is through the TV, and which one is through the internet? So we've got 5%, 8.5%, and 36%. Internet, okay.
DAB, 36%.
DAB. Well, so through the television, it's 5%. Through the internet is 8.4%. And 36% is listening through DAB.
Interesting.
And I think what it kind of shows is people like listening to the radio through our radio. It's one of the devices that we should be really proud of owning in this kind of crazy cross-platform industry. The fact that there's a box in your car or at your home is still a really powerful thing to have in a household. And some charts, so how that's changed over time, it's about 10 years worth of data. Blue at the top being analog, which is still very strong, and then that growth of DAB and growth of digital TV and the internet, but actually not quite as fast-paced. And we've started to see that digital TV is kind of leveled off a bit as people are using other platforms to listen. When we look at the amount they consume, so the amount of hours every week listened to on the radio, still that big blue C is analog radio, but we can kind of see that decline. And what that means for us in the radio industry is it's slightly tougher. We've got listeners in lots of different places consuming lots of different types of radio. Also means there's more competition. So like Jillian flicking through her set, if I flick through mine next to my bedside, these are the 85 stations that you can listen to on digital radio in London. Huge amounts of competition from stations you know, stations you don't, religious, ethnic, and actually outside of the BBC, a large majority of those being commercial radio. But what digital radio has done is it's allowed new entrants to come into the market and provide more services. But it is a consolidated market. The BBC accounts for about 52% of listening. Nick's bosses at Global, their group is 20% of listening. Bauer, the German radio group, 15%. And all of the rest are 12%. So those 3 companies have a huge impact in what we listen to every day. But digital radio has allowed us to do something different, which is for radio groups and to launch new services, kind of spin-offs. So Absolute Radio have launched a suite of radio stations covering different decades. And what's interesting, I'll explain the chart. So the big blue chunk at the bottom is listening to that main station, Absolute Radio, over time. And you can see this sort of dip point. The big dip is when they rebranded from Virgin Radio to Absolute Radio. So the figures went down, and they decided to launch a new service, that big green block, which is Absolute 80s. And then 90s and 70s over and above that. And what it's meant for that company is they've doubled their audience over that sort of 15-year period because they've managed to get their stations out to more people. For me, I run a children's radio station, particularly for kind of 6 to 12-year-olds is our core audience. And our presenters, you can see on the screen, never have to get a proper job. They can just interview people, play games, talk to Cookie Monster, all the big things. I'm sure their parents are really happy for them. But what we think about is trying to make content absolutely that comes from the radio, but exists in lots of places. So you can listen to that Science Weekly as a podcast. You can watch Sean's videos on YouTube. He's our breakfast show presenter. On particular kids' social media, we'll try and be in those places. And we know to be a vibrant, modern medium that kids are excited to listen to, we've got to be in all the places they are. And that's kind of a microcosm of the same for all of commercial radio. We've got to be in all the places where our listeners are. And it means we're on those 8 platforms really every day, reaching hundreds of thousands of people in different ways and trying to keep kids interested and deliver them a great service. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I won't ask you just yet what you think of Peppa Pig, who in our house might be your big competitor. Nick, how does it feel to have had Mr. Gove at your mercy this morning?
Well, I was just thinking it's desperately unfair, really, because your breakfast presenter, Matt, gets to interview the Cookie Monster and I get Michael Gove. There probably is. But I just start, delegates, by saying I'm, like you, puzzled as to why I'm here, because I'm flanked by people who know more about, who've forgotten more about radio than I will ever know, someone who runs radio stations, someone who's selling our radio content around the world. So what am I doing here? Well, the truth is I, too, am frightened of Jillian Reynolds. So that's why I'm here on the hottest day of the year in this room. There's pointless me, because these people have told you fantastic facts and figures, and I'm not even going to attempt. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the difference, because I remind us all of what the, not the motion is, but what we are discussing, which is the contribution of commercial radio. And let me tell you, commercial radio needs to exist because of its brutal honesty. The BBC is fantastic, and it would be ridiculous to suggest otherwise. And I have briefly worked at the BBC on BBC Radio. And I want to tell you a story that illustrates the point I want to make. Many, many years ago, there was a show on 5 Live called Late Night Curry, presented by Edwina Curry. And Miss Curry used to take a lot of weekends off. We could never quite work out why. When her book came out, it had major reasons why she used to take the weekend off. And I used to fill in a lot, which was great, because I'd just been fired by Kelvin Mackenzie after 1 year of talk radio and was told to piss off and destroy other people's businesses, you fat turd, which I thought one bit of that was a little unfair, but the rest of it probably was okay. So I found myself at Pebblemill in Birmingham, late night on a Saturday, late night on a Sunday, and the illustration, the difference between what the BBC do magnificently, but the sheer honesty and brutality in the fact that we live by our wits in commercial radio was brought forth thus. We go back to the days of, and I've forgotten you worked with them, Tony Blair's administration and the problem with foot and mouth. And I suddenly go off on this rant or whatever it is. Isn't it disgraceful the way this government is handled foot and mouth? There are tourists coming in, the rotting stench of funeral pyres as they load cattle into empty trenches and pour gasoline, and the black smoke billows over our green and pleasant. So this female producer, of course, listening to this, I'm on the BBC, right? So he says, balance, in my head, balance. And I, oh, Christ. So how do I get out of that? And I looked at the next morning's papers, and there was actually a family shot of the Blairs coming out of church or going, and all I could say was, but don't they take a lovely family picture? That's all I could think of. I didn't have a long career at the BBC, strangely, and I washed up at commercial radio, and I have to tell you, I love it. And I love it because of its sheer honesty. And providing I'm not saying anything ridiculous, as long as I take a stance that is intellectually justifiable, whatever it might be, there's no point just being ridiculously just shock radio or whatever it was, then that is what I am permitted to do. The balance is provided by the caller, and that can sometimes contribute to some of the most amazing radio. Jillian is often quite kind to me about in her previous columns in the Telegraph, now in the Sunday Times, because it is the raw honesty
Wait till you read this week.
Do I stay or do I go? Some of it is comedy that Peter Kay or Harry, they could not script. Some of it is searing honesty. For instance, I will never forget, and I appreciate I'm coming up to my 5 minutes, I will never forget we were discussing once the importance of always having a Holocaust Remembrance Day and never ever letting it go, particularly pertinent actually where we find ourselves at this time, a political party, but this was some years ago. And we were talking about it. And I took a call from a very heavily accented woman who lived in Temple Fortune. I can still hear her voice and I can still hear her name. And she came with a sort of very heavily accented German voice, and she said, it is very important that we must always remember. Why do you, it was Claire, Temple Fortune. Why do you say that, Claire? Because I was at Auschwitz. I said, oh my God, right, okay. And I was at Auschwitz as a 14-year-old girl. And she always used to call me Mr. Ferrari. Mr. Ferrari, can you imagine what it was like? I won't do the accent because it's inappropriate. What can you imagine what it was like being a 14-year-old girl in Auschwitz? Claire, well, whatever you're thinking of, Mr. Ferrari, just double it, and it's worse still. Oh, Claire, I'm so sorry. How do you explain that to your children? Mr. Ferrari, I've never told my children, and I've never told my grandchildren. I said, Claire, you've never told your children, and you're telling me why? Because I trust you, and you've taken me through so much. And she said, all the years I've been listening to you, we just have that relationship. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't great calls to the BBC, there are, but because of the honesty that we have, because we can be a little bit cheeky, because we can be a little bit naughty, and sometimes, and I think there are regulators in the room, we probably do get the occasional rap across our knuckles, because we are funded in a different way. We have to be out there shouting the loudest from the street, or the loudest that we can, trying to appeal, living by our wits every day, because I'm not knocking it, it does great programming, but the BBC enjoys a unique funding that we don't, and that is why I would argue to you the honesty, the sheer rawness of commercial radio is so crucial to the British way of life.
Thank you. I will share with you my painful secret. I have to write on a Tuesday for the Sunday Times for publication on a Sunday, which is really difficult because I'm writing off a lot of previews. I only have sort of Saturday, Sunday, Monday to catch things live because the copy has to be in. So I'm having to think in a different way. And I thought, because I'd covered Jacob Rees-Mogg's Sunday morning broadcast and found it most amusing, I thought, I'll do him when he's on with Nick in his new slot this Monday. So I've written about it for this Sunday.
Well, thanks ever so much. 97.3 if you want to listen.
But not only that, I now have to do podcasts, and we must talk about podcasts. I now have to do podcast of the week. And this is one of life's more miserable chores because most of the podcasts that get sent to me or I'm referred to are about murders. They're about unsolved murders. They're usually about unsolved murders of women. And I said, I've had enough of it. So I have recommended my podcast listeners to watch the video of you with Jacob Rees-Mogg, because I have to tell you, it's a bit like a comic strip, because every time it cuts away to you, you're going, tee.
Like the Beano.
Like the Beano. Now, questions, everybody. I've talked far too much. Yes, up the back.
That's so the Kremlin can get the question.
My name is John Preston, and I think I'm simultaneously the newest and the oldest member at this meeting. And because of the second statement, I'm addressing myself to Dr. Stoller, because, and he said Stroller, what was the climate that enabled the BBC to create the Marine Offences Act to destroy what could have been very successful commercial radio? Why did the BBC want the monopoly at that time?
I'm not sure it's fair to lay the blame at the door of the BBC. I think that there was probably from the legacy of the Second World War, a sense amid the, what would we call them, the British establishment, that the BBC had had a good war and deserved to trade on it. And given that so much attention had moved across to what was happening in television and the considerable success of ITV, not just in terms of popular ratings, but in terms of programme making and news quality, there was very little attention at all on what radio was doing. And it was only when everybody got shaken up by these pirate radio stations blasting in. Well, they weren't shaken up only by that. Radio was shaken up by that. Everybody had been shaken up by Jailhouse Rock if they were under 25. Suddenly there was a feeling that there were things running out of control. The 60s were running out of the control of the people who used to run the place. And so there was a wish to stop it somehow. Add to that that not all of the pirate radio ships were exactly politically neutral. There were certainly broadcasts urging people to vote one way or another in general elections, which didn't go down very well. And add to that also a sense which continued within the Labour Party right up until probably the late 70s, that somehow this was going to be against them. There was a general coming together amid the political classes to say that this must stop. And the BBC was slightly reluctantly persuaded to do pop radio. After all, it had previously broadcast about 1 hour of pop music a week in the early 60s. So there was a good deal of reluctance. But I don't think it's fair to blame the BBC for the legislation. I think you can blame the government of the day, and indeed some of their political opponents, but by no means all.
Thank you. Siobhan, you wanted to add something to that, I think.
No, I was going to make exactly the same point, sorry, boringly, but of course it's always going to be the government of the day that decides, and I can absolutely see with that background of the war, which I hadn't really thought about before. I think that's an interesting point.
Okay, I have a question down here and then one over there.
Yeah, I'm Jill Allen King, a founder member of VLV as well, and appreciate all the help that has been given to us over the years. And first of all, I want to just say, while we're here today, 250 people in this country will lose their sight. And the one thing that they will carry on being able to do is listen to the radio. And that is much appreciated by over 2 million people now in this country that appreciate especially local radio. And I went totally blind at the age of 24 on my wedding day, and I lived in Southend. I still do, and I was fortunate enough to have Radio Caroline that had just gone on air. And in those 3 weeks in hospital, that I drove the doctors mad because I would not turn my radio off. But you know, I can laugh at it now, but I can assure you that that radio station kept me going and gave me an inspiration to live. And so I've always been a great contributor as well to local radio. And although I did for all 5 years contribute a daily script to Essex Radio, the commercial station, once BBC Essex came on 31 years ago, I do listen to that and I do get all the information that I want. And my question to you all really is, I don't know whether you do appreciate and understand the real meaning of local radio to those blind and partially sighted people as well as other disabled people in the UK.
Nick, would you like to?
Jill, you make a first-class point. I realise, because of the calls I take, Jill, I have a number of blind listeners, and I see you've got your excellent dog here. Mm-hmm. And when I have a caller called Audrey in Sanderstead, who updates me regularly, and when Bongo, her guide dog, died, I was almost as sad as Audrey because I felt I've lived with Bongo. The reason I think it's really important, Jill, you make this point is, and I know, Jillian, you want to come on to this. Of course, I'm excited by what Matt talks about, all these great advances that we're making in radio, and this rather extraordinary thing that Jillian said, that with Jacob Rees-Mogg, for the first time ever, you could see Jacob Rees-Mogg and I in 360-degree surround or something by looking at your mobile phone. I mean, if there's anybody less appropriate to do that with than Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is known as the Minister for the 17th century, I have absolutely no idea. So, of course, we must do that, because, of course, radio must build, and radio has to attract in younger listeners, and Matt is doing that. But we must not forget what our core audience is, which is delivering compelling stories, telling them in an interesting way, or music, of course, and great audio, and encouraging listeners and building on that. And I do believe we must explore all those others, but if we lose that, we really will lose what I believe to be the true essence of radio. And just briefly, this is a great story to tell your children, your grandchildren, or whatever, when you're next with them. I saw Joe Johnson, the universities minister, a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me, and you were talking about Alexa and